give to the people of the world and all its inhabitants. We've got to learn to live together with some understanding and care for each other. Let's go the extra mile and do it with a smile. Said if it's true, tell me why we cannot try. Tell me why, yes, if there is a reason why. If it's true, tell me why we cannot try harder.
So I am speaking with Chris Hedges, who probably needs no introduction whatsoever. He is a Pulitzer Prize winner, the author of 14, is it 14 books, Chris, or did I miss one or two?
14,
Okay.
I think that's right.
All right. And in my opinion, one of the greatest living intellectuals in the country. He also received the Amnesty International Award for Human Rights Journalism in addition to the Pulitzer Prize. So since I pronounced the word Pulitzer and Pulitzer in two different ways, I'm bound to be right 50% of the time. Anyway, Chris, boy, this I'm not even sure exactly where to begin, but let me start with a quote that I sent to you that I thought was particularly interesting given some of the things that I've gone through in the last 10 years of my life, but which you'd have some personal feelings about, I think, and that is that Elizabeth Gilbert, who wrote The Signature of All Things, was introducing Robin Wall Kimmerer, who wrote Braiding Sweetgrass, to an audience, and she said, "We live in a society where religion, science, and art have all gone through a tremendous, bitter divorce, followed by a whole custody battle over our souls and our minds." And she said, until recently, things were not always this way. Excuse me. That Darwin studied to be a minister. I know you're an ordained minister, Chris, and so she said that Kimmerer makes the case that we've unbraided these three strands and that they have made it particularly difficult for us to get back to some kind of civil discourse in the country. What do you think about that?
Well, yes, because religion, and I'm not talking about institutional religion, but I'm talking about religious thought, like art, is designed to deal with the non-rational forces that go into making a complete and a whole human being. I'm not talking about irrational, I'm talking about non-rational. So beauty, grief, love. Freud said he could write about sex, but it was extremely difficult for him to write about love. The search for meaning, the struggle with our own mortality. These are the issues that can't be measured scientifically. They can't be quantified. They are, in a certain sense, a mystery. And in a technocratic society where you relegate those fundamental questions about existence to the margins, indeed, a consumer society is a perpetual celebration of youth. And as you get older, there's all sorts of ways, whether it's plastic surgery or Botox or whatever, to sort of essentially create masks that defy aging. We're a society that doesn't deal or cope with the reality of death the way a society a century ago, death was something palpable. It was all around you. So yes, I think that the withering of the arts, the decline of, and much of the decline of religion is due to the failures of the institutional church, which has been infected by the wider culture like every other institution, but it has left us alienated, trapped in what the sociologist Emile Durkheim would call an anomie. I mean, I wrote a book called America, the Farewell Tour, and it looked at these pathologies, self-destructive pathologies that arise in a society where the social bonds are severed, where you don't have a place, whether it's at work or within your community. That and this again comes out of Durkheim. So I write about heroin addicts. I write about suicide. I write about addictions like gambling. I write about hate groups because, as Durkheim said, those who seek the annihilation of others are driven by longings for self-annihilation. We see that in almost every mass shooting, which occurs now on more than a daily basis in the United States. So there is something deeply diseased about American society, unmoored, and I think that much of it comes from the predominance of a technocratic society and the failure to confront those non-rational forces that go into making a complete, mature human being. I mean, the Buddhists say you can memorize as many sutras as you want, but it doesn't make you wise. And we've lost our wisdom. I think that when you go back to the roots of every religious belief system, it is intimately intertwined with art, because my wife is an actor. She's currently in a play, Pericles, in New York. It is intertwined. Art it gives voice to our ancestors. It's an empathy vehicle because it, when it's done well, allows us to step into the shoes of others, especially those who may be different or demonized or suffering. And yeah, the society is in deep, deep distress. And I think all of the warning signs of that distress, including the violence, the siloing of the country into antagonistic demographics that not only have this kind of celebration of us, and the liberals are as guilty of this as the right wing, but of course the utter demonization of those they oppose. So yeah, she's very right, and we are currently suffering the consequences.
Well, you mentioned the book America, the Farewell Tour, and I know that you spend a lot of time discussing with various groups the ills of society in a powerful way, and I wonder if you have any sense of hope that lies beyond that we can overcome this.
Well, I don't see, I'm pretty bleak. I mean, you know, we look at the climate science alone, and the utter failure on the part of the society at large, and in particular the ruling elite, to deal with the greatest existential crisis facing not just the human species, but most species on the planet. And it's pretty hard to walk away from whatever the latest climate report is hopeful. On the other hand, I think hope is grounded not in the abstract, but in the real. So, as you know, I teach in a prison. I teach college credit courses in the New Jersey prison system through Rutgers University. And I've had neighbors say, well, isn't it depressing? And it's not. It's, of course, the highlight of my week, because here you have these individuals locked in cages not much larger than your bathroom, going, and of course, even their lives previously, before they got into prison, they come out of distressed, deindustrialized urban neighborhoods, what Malcolm X called our internal colonies. I mean, everything was stacked against them from birth, including, of course, most of them are black. So they stacked against them, not just economically, but racially, socially, in every way. And yet they find, and I don't think many of us could achieve what they achieve, or go through what they've gone through and achieve what they could achieve. And they, I have students who graduate summa cum laude from Rutgers. Imagine doing that from inside a prison. I had one student, you can matriculate to Rutgers if you have over a 3.1 average. He matriculated, graduated summa cum laude, and got the first Harry S. Truman Fellowship of any Rutgers student in over a decade, and went to the University of Cambridge in England and got his master's degree in philosophy. That's hope. I taught a class once had a student who was imprisoned at the age of 14 for a crime he didn't commit. His parents were dead. He was living on the streets of Camden, New Jersey, in an abandoned house. He was illiterate. There was a rape and a killing. He was picked up, forced to sign a confession. He couldn't read. And when he heard what he had confessed to in court, and of course, he had no legal or parental supervision while he was being coerced into signing this document by 3 Camden City detectives. When he heard what he was charged with in court, he tried to protest, but it didn't matter. He was sentenced and as an adult and was not eligible for parole until he was 70 years old. That didn't mean he'd be released at 70. It meant he could only make his first appeal to be paroled at the age of 70. And I've taught him many times, was one of my most dedicated students. And I taught a class called Conquest, where we read Open Veins of Latin America, Bury My Heart at Wounded Knee, and C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins, which is on the Haitian independence movement, the only successful slave revolt in human history, and Haiti's still paying for it. And I don't give out a lot of A's. He was one of 2 or 3. And he waited till everyone had left the classroom, and you have to move quickly because when you line up in the hall after the bell goes off, if you're not lined up in time, you can get a charge from the guards. And he waited till the classroom was empty, and then he said, I know I'm going to die in this prison, but I work as hard as I do because one day I'm going to be a teacher like you. And he walked out. That's hope. That's what keeps me going. And it's grounded in not the abstract, but in the concrete and the real and the specific. And I don't pretend that either he or I changed the prison system. I don't pretend that, the world was made an exponentially better place. But it's those experiences. And I think too often people on the left do not have real relationships with those who are oppressed. And that's very dangerous. That if you don't walk out of that prison angry, then you don't have a heart. And that, those kinds of experiences. And as you know, as a foreign correspondent, I spent most of my time with people who were subject to horrible repression. 5 years in El Salvador, 7 years in the Middle East. I was in Sarajevo during the war in Yugoslavia, former Yugoslavia. So I think it's those tangible relationships that keep us going and give us hope, and yet don't blind us to the bleakness around us. And in the case of the student I just mentioned, Lawrence, I do want to say that I went to the head of the public defender's office in New Jersey, and after the Supreme Court ruling that juveniles could not be sentenced as adults, we got him in a resentencing hearing. He was released. He had no family, so I raised the money to rent him an apartment so he could finish his college degree, which he did. He graduated summa cum laude from Rutgers, and he's currently working as a community organizer in Brooklyn. So that's where I get my hope. It's in those, perhaps to the rest of the world, trivial or marginal experiences, but it's not trivial or marginal to me, and it's not trivial or marginal to him.
Yeah, it makes me think of the quote I often hear you use from, I think it was Daniel Berrigan, about the good drawing to it the good.
Yeah, well, that's what I asked Daniel Berrigan, who baptized my youngest daughter, how he defined faith. And he said the good draws to it the good, and that empirically everything around us may say otherwise. And certainly everything that I care about and have fought for throughout my life is worse. There's no question about it. And he said, the Buddhists believe in karma, but we don't know where it goes. And I think that's a good definition of faith, because you survive by faith. There's nothing tangible or empirical to justify this notion that the good draws to it the good. And yet, having spent much of my life in war, I can say that the good does draw to it the good. I mean, evil is real. Radical evil is real and palpable. When I got to El Salvador in 1983, the death squads were killing between 700 and 1,000 people a month. The Salvadoran Archbishop, Oscar Romero, had been assassinated. I came not long after the 4 American churchwomen were raped and murdered by the Salvadoran National Guard. So I certainly know the evil. And yet I saw figures like Romero, whose name resonates throughout not just Salvador, but all of Latin America. So yes, I think the good does draw to it the good, yet at the same time, evil will always be with us.
Yeah. Well, you've, in the course of your lifetime, you've experienced the most awful side of humanity, as well as the most ennobling side of humanity. Maybe you could give us a positive story about that really will be something that people can hold on to.
Well, I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe, in East Germany, run largely by Lutheran clergy out of Leipzig. I covered the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. Then Czechoslovakia was in a Magic Lantern Theater every night with Václav Havel. And I covered the fall of Ceausescu and Romania, which didn't quite turn out quite so well as the other ones. But yeah, I watched figures like Havel. I mean, Havel became a non-person in 1977 when he signed the Human Rights Declaration, Charter 77. If you wanted to hear, certainly one of Czechoslovakia's most important intellectuals, playwrights and intellectuals, he was in and out of prison, constant surveillance. He couldn't publish. His plays weren't performed. If you wanted to hear Havel's voice, whether it was directly Havel's voice or readings from Havel's writings, you had to listen to Voice of America. He was a fascinating figure because he wasn't a particularly gifted speaker. He wasn't even very charismatic, but everyone knew that he wouldn't sell them out. And so there was no question when you were building the opposition movement that it was around Havel. And those figures who had resisted in 1968 the Soviet invasion that overthrew Dubček and imposed a Soviet-backed regime had also been rendered non-persons, including Czechoslovakia's great singer Marta Kubasheva, who had sung a song called A Prayer for Marta, which was the kind of anthem of defiance against the Soviets. Once Dubček was overthrown and the Soviet regime, pro-Soviet regime, was installed, her recording stock, she was probably the most popular singer in Czechoslovakia, was destroyed. She never appeared again on the airwaves. She worked in the intervening years on an assembly line at a toy factory. So I was in Wenceslas Square in 1989 with 500,000 Czechs, most of whom had been born after 1968, and Kubasheva walked out on that balcony, a moment I'll never forget, and began to sing A Prayer for Marta. And every Czech in the crowd knew every word. And that is, those are magnificent moments that show the power of the good, the power of the human spirit, if not always to triumph, then to endure.
Yeah. Chris, you talked about the ideological silos, and one of the ones that is most often employed by the politicians anyway is sort of the what I consider to be largely outmoded twin ideologies of capitalism and socialism. Is there a story that we can be telling ourselves that would serve us better than those two things?
Well, I'm a socialist. I'm not a Marxist. I think
Hmm.
Marx's critique of capitalism is correct. I think Marx's solution is utopian. I use the word the way Thomas More coined it. It literally means utopia, no place. Um, uh, but I'm a kind of Swedish style socialist. You saw in the Nordic countries, certainly by the 1970s, the ability to abolish poverty, to provide healthcare, a good education, free for their population, to make sure that unions were strong, and unions are exceedingly important. In fact, that socialist project in Sweden was created by a heavily unionized population. I think it's 76%, if I remember, of the Swedish workforce was unionized. And in order to fight back and create that kind of Swedish socialist state, there were innumerable, many strikes, far more than probably any other country in Europe, in order to regulate and control the capitalist class. Now, they managed to reverse that in Sweden, unfortunately, which was also true in Israel. When I first got in Israel, Israel was a socialist country, and that was dismantled in the name of neoliberalism. So this is not the same as anti-capitalism. I don't have a problem with capitalism, but unregulated, uncontrolled, unchecked capitalism, as Karl Polanyi, the great economist, writes, does what it's designed to do, and that is to increase profits and reduce the cost of production, i.e., labor. That is the logic of capitalism, but unchecked, uncontrolled, capitalism by its nature will exploit everything, including human beings and the natural world, until exhaustion or collapse. And unfortunately, we have unregulated, uncontrolled capitalism, which is destroying, disemboweling our societies. Much of my family comes from Maine. Those mill towns are a wreck. Well, it's not untrue in New Hampshire either. Even Vermont. I was
Right.
surprised. I spoke at the Vermont Law School and had to drive 3 hours down from uh, Burlington, and I was not prepared for the poverty that I saw in Vermont. So I remember what those towns were like. None of my relatives made much money. They worked in the mills. My uncle ran a lumber mill, um, but they made a living. I mean, and now it's gone. I mean, even the bank in the town, Mechanic Falls, where my grandparents were from, has been boarded up and shut down. So, and this is writ large across the country, because essentially global oligarchs, the billionaire class, the corporate class, was able to abolish all control and all regulations, and of course corrupt the political system. So and recreate it through dark money into a system of legalized bribery. So whether it's a state capital in New Hampshire or whether it's Washington, the lobbyists are writing the legislation, and bought and paid for politicians from both sides, Republican and Democrat, are pushing it through to pass it. So we've undergone what John Ralston Saul, a Canadian philosopher, calls a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion. That's correct. It's over. So yeah, I mean, I think FDR had socialist policies in the New Deal, which I support. A country with our kind of wealth, there should not be children going to bed hungry. There should not be children with aptitude and promise being denied the possibility of an education. We should not allow parents, because of a private healthcare system, to bankrupt themselves trying to save their sons or daughters who are sick. I mean, there's an underlying cruelty and even savagery to this system that's masked by essentially a corporate controlled media. The reality is one thing, and then the illusion has been Disneyfied. But that disconnect is breaking down, because we're now living with the greatest social inequality in American history, and it doesn't stop. I mean, I got a scholarship to a private boarding school, and so grew up around a lot of the sons of the rich. My high school graduation speaker was John D. Rockefeller, and so I watched how affirmative action for the wealthy works. I mean, I go back to Maine, and my relatives especially my grandfather, who never finished high school because his sister's husband died, and he was academically very gifted, but he had to drop out and go work the farm because she had 3 children. They had to eat. And I just understood that we live in a society where the rich get chance after chance after chance after chance, and the poor are lucky if they get one chance, and then they get another. If they get that, and then they never get another one. So I think that kind of schizophrenic existence between being schooled with the rich but coming from the working class gave me a kind of insight into how stacked and unfair the system is. I mean, Rockefeller, when he died, I think was worth $3 billion, or I don't know, 5 billion, something like that. We now have oligarchs worth $180 billion. I mean, this is unseen. I mean, you'd probably have to go back to pharaonic Egypt or something to find that kind of personal wealth. And of course, they wield tremendous power with that wealth to our detriment and their benefit. I mean, as Warren Buffett said it, there's a class war, and his class is winning, and we're not.
Right. And you mentioned it earlier that the Democrats are as much to blame as the Republicans are in this, even though, after 4 years of Donald Trump, there's some feeling that it's not quite even. But when I was first elected to the legislature in New Hampshire, I had a good friend who used to call them limousine liberals, and he'd say, don't you ever become one of those people who would do everything for the working guy except have dinner with him.
Well, or block his unions. I mean, look, Biden, sorry, it's my dog. Biden pitches himself as a pro-labor president, and then when the freight workers want a new contract, I'm going to close my door. My Greyhound.
Okay, no problem.
Okay, quiet. What are you doing? Okay, some phantom. Anyway, when when the rail workers want a new contract and over 50% of the union members that are unionized vote to accept it, Biden, by legislative fiat, rams down a contract that they've rejected and essentially revokes the capacity for collective bargaining. And remember, that was a campaign promise to strengthen collective bargaining, revokes the capacity for collective bargaining among one of the few groups of workers that have the power of collective bargaining. So the rhetoric of the Democratic Party is better, but the hard reality is the same. I mean, that most of the real damage to the working class was done under the Clinton administration with NAFTA, which was the worst betrayal of American workers since the 1947 Taft-Hartley Act. Clinton destroyed welfare, and 70% of the original recipients of welfare were children. Clinton deregulated the FCC, so allowed roughly a half dozen corporations huge mega corporations to seize the airwaves and control what 90% of Americans watch or listen to. And of course, public television and public radio is starved for funds. NPR just had, I think, 10% layoffs, canceled a bunch of podcasts, and they're already very anemic. Because they depend on corporate sponsors, they are very wary about doing news stories about corporate abuse. Clinton ripped down the firewalls between commercial and investment banks, and Glass-Steagall Act, and precipitated with the financial meltdown the banking crisis. 500 banks shut down, were closed. Canada did not have a banking crisis during the 2007-2008 financial crash because they didn't tear down those firewalls. They didn't allow their local banks to essentially become hedge funds. So much of the destruction was done by the Democrats. They're both essentially after the Clinton administration, which took corporate money to do corporate bidding. We created the duopoly, which is now completely merged into one ruling establishment party. All of the establishment Democrats, Liz Cheney, even the pundits, Republican pundits, Bill Kristol and Mitt Romney, they're all fused into one ruling party. And what they're fighting against is this kind of proto-fascist, Christian fascist, enraged group of largely white working class who, let's be clear, I come out of the white working class, were betrayed. There's no question they were betrayed. And there's no question that their rage is legitimate. It's just, unfortunately, being expressed in very negative ways. And they did it. And my relatives in Maine, they weren't educated in a sense, and none of them went to college or anything, but they weren't stupid. I mean, they know who did this to them.
Right. So, well, the all of this led us to Donald Trump, but it's so much of it seems to be related to the fact that for 50 years we've hollowed out the middle class and the working class in this country, and to say nothing of what's happened to the poor in that process. Is there anything that you have been listening to or thinking about that could help us begin to bridge that gap?
Well, we have to rebuild unions, which are the one mechanism that working men and women have to essentially pressure the powerful, and that's through strikes. And of course, they've worked very hard to revoke the ability to strike or even to create unions, right to work laws and everything else. The corporate controlled media demonizes unions, has quite effectively. So that's the only hope. Shama Sawant, the socialist city councilwoman from Seattle, is organizing a nationwide kind of militant union. I mean, part of the problems is that the mainstream unions have kind of sold out. They just become junior partners to the corporate oligarchs. But yeah, it's, if you want, I mean, we're watching it in Israel right now. I mean, if you want to put pressure, there's only one way to do it, and that's from the street and through the mechanism of the strike. And that is our only hope. So our energy has to go into rebuilding movements that can protect ourselves from a very rapacious, callous, and cruel and greedy ruling class. And that's, without that, we're absolutely helpless.
So you don't put any stock in some politician coming along who kind of like Andrew Yang did, talked about a universal basic income or some mechanism for bridging the divide between for doing something about this savage disparity of wealth that now exists.
Well, the universal income is a scam because the Silicon Valley is quite aware that the plummeting incomes, and let's not forget the massive household debt that is crippling the American citizen, not just household debt, but student loans, credit card debt in their mortgages, which what are mortgage rates now? I don't know, 8% or something. So they understand that as the wealth is kind of funneled upwards into the hands of the billionaire class, people aren't going to be able to buy their products. And so that when they propose universal income, and I'm not actually against it, but it's completely out of self-interest because they know that income's going to go to the absurd credit card payments. I mean, once you're late on your credit card, I don't know, what is it now, 18%? I mean, you're just in a death spiral. So, and of course, with a for-profit healthcare system, we have 500,000 a year go bankrupt. Families go bankrupt because they can't afford their medical bills, and a huge percentage of them have insurance. But of course, they're too sick to work, and because it's employer-based, they eventually lose their insurance at the moment they most need their health insurance. So, I mean, the system's just completely rigged. The solution will not come from the top. It will come from the bottom. It will come from those of us who create powerful mechanisms that hold the ruling corporate duopoly in check. I mean, there's a famous story, I've often said it, but I'll say it again, from Kissinger's memoirs. It's the early 70s. One of the largest anti-war demonstrations in the country is taking place around the White House. The security has put empty city buses end to end in a ring around the White House to protect the White House. And Nixon is looking out at these sea of demonstrators and says to Kissinger that, Henry, they're going to break through the barricades and get us. Well, that's where we want people in power to be. And it's our job to put them there. And if we don't put them there, they're going to do what power always does, which is consolidate power and wealth to itself.
I don't remember where the to which president it was attributed. It was either Lincoln or Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, that had a meeting with a group of people, and at the end of the meeting, having given them some satisfaction that he was on their side, he turned to them and said, "And now you have to make me do it."
Yeah, that was Roosevelt to union
Roosevelt,
leaders.
okay,
And they did.
yeah.
And after the end of World War II, the business class made it a priority to break those unions, and also with the McCarthyite blacklists, purge the press, the universities, even of course Hollywood, of anybody who came out of that kind of radical militant left, because they saw that power and how it had to be denuded.
So is it safe to say, Chris, that you think that the salvation lies with the grassroots of the country rising up to demand better?
Yeah, it lies with workers at Amazon, workers at Walmart. I mean, so much of my family comes from a small town in Maine, Norway, Maine, and it used to have a vibrant downtown. And then, of course, they built a giant big box Walmart where everybody earns minimum wage, and they kill the downtown, and then they suck all the money out of the town. Well, the guy who ran the hardware store and the clothing store, and I mean, these people sat on the school board, they paid taxes, they were part of the community, not just economically, but civically. Right. It's destroyed, and that's just repeated everywhere. And so, I mean, Walmart, the family of the Walton family, I think somebody said they calculated that they made $11,000 an hour or something from Walmart. Walmart and Amazon are, I think, the two largest employers in the country. Both of them are fighting unions, and we have to create unions to hold those forces in check. I mean, Walmart has kind of built this very sophisticated scheme. They stagger work time so people aren't laid off in a group. They have strike-breaking teams. They fly in by jet. They have spies inside there. So and Amazon is ruthless. And look at the money these people have. I mean, what's Bezos, I think, is also worth, well, I don't know how much he's worth after his divorce, but, 180 billion. I mean, think about it. I mean, this is just a staggering amount of money. And frankly obscene. And they don't pay taxes, or they pay very little taxes. I mean, that's the other thing the rich have done by legislative fiat, and that is to essentially orchestrate a tax boycott. I mean, a couple of years ago, Amazon as a corporation not only didn't pay any taxes, they got money back from the federal government. So we're being fleeced, we're being robbed, we're being absolutely stripped, and then you get the whole gig and temp economy where they'll use you and then discard you. I mean, that's kind of where we're headed. Everything is becoming temp work with no benefits, even in academia at Rutgers with all the adjuncts who make only about $4,000 or $5,000 a class. So, they do a full course load. They're only making about $25,000 a year without health insurance or benefits.
Yeah.
It's completely lopsided. And then what's some banker in Citibank pulling down? For what? For managing debt. It's a debt-driven economy. It's about throwing a population in debt peonage, and then that's why they keep wages down. That's why they will not raise wages, because the whole point. And now we see Janet Yellen trying to curb inflation by fostering, and she's open about it, unemployment. Because unemployment is good to bring down inflation. Well, it's not good for families where nobody has a job. I mean, the values are completely inverted.
Right.
And voices that question those values are really locked out. You don't hear them. You may hear them on the margins of the internet. I now, like Matt Taibbi and Glenn Greenwald, have a Substack chrishedges.substack.com, which does very well, but it's not. Critiques like mine are not acceptable, even on public radio or public TV, and that wasn't always true. I mean, you could go back a few decades and you could see Noam Chomsky and Howard Zinn on public media, and the whole idea of public media is that it gives a voice to people who are not beholden to the powerful or the rich. But they've been completely captive now.
Yeah. Now, most of the younger listeners will not know what the fairness doctrine was. So I guess I'd ask you to explain what it was and how that has changed, how the ending of that fairness doctrine happened, and how it's changed the media landscape.
Well, the fairness doctrine meant that if everybody had equal time, that if you had, Jeff Bezos talking garbage about Amazon workers, that you had to give them equal time. And that fairness doctrine was abolished. I forget under which administration. I think it may have been Reagan. So essentially, there was no requirement within the press to give a platform to opposing voices. And so the voices you hear or see through our electronic hallucinations we now carry around in our tracking devices are invariably those perpetuated by the ruling oligarchy.
Yeah. So, right. So there is no mechanism for protecting or assuring that we actually hear both sides of an argument or multiple sides of an argument.
Well, it's even worse than that, because a lot of the attacks and a lot of the characterizations, I mean, on the whole debate over Obamacare, those who supported universal health care were shut out. I mean, we spend, I think it's over $12,000 per person on average in the United States for health care. And we have the least efficient healthcare system in the industrialized world. In Canada, they spend about $5,000. I think they spend $8,000 in Germany. But everyone has healthcare. Healthcare is a human right. And so you have examples in several countries, the UK and others, where it's far more cost effective, it's far cheaper, and the healthcare service is far, far better. I mean, people aren't denied healthcare. I mean, how many people died? I think 300,000 Americans died during the pandemic because they couldn't afford treatment. You don't have that, but those kinds of facts were locked out. And my friend Dennis Kucinich, who I'm about to do an event with in Austin, Texas in a couple of days, was campaigning on that issue. But it turns out the Presidential Debate Commission is a private corporation, and it was sponsored by Big Pharma. And they locked him out. They would not allow him on the debate. They kept changing the rules. You had to be in the top 4 or 5, I can't remember. But there came a point, I think it was in New Hampshire, that he was in the top 4 or 5, and they wouldn't let him through the doors. So, there's a perfect example of how we would all be better served by universal health care. I mean, we spend up to, I think it's 40% of our money goes to administrative costs. And then you've got the massive bonuses and salaries that are paid to Big Pharma. These CEOs are making, tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars in profit at our expense. So it's a completely corrupt system. It's not efficient. It doesn't function. It creates tremendous amount of unnecessary suffering. It's far overpriced, but you can't get that on, those kinds of facts that's a classic example of how they've essentially locked the doors to any kind of rational debate about healthcare. And it's not just healthcare, but it's all sorts of stuff.
Right. But it all boils down to citizens not standing for it. To use.
Well, that's right. It's live free or die. I mean, that's it. You gotta pick which one you want. And it doesn't mean having a gun in the back of your truck. And I say that coming from a family where gun racks were in the back of all of our trucks. It comes from building movements, from organizing, from building powerful movements that can hold the corporate billionaire class in check and reverse the kind of pillage that they're carrying out on the rest of us.
Right. Chris, your Substack account is chrishedges@substack.com, correct?
chrishedges.substack.com.
Substack, right?
So that's got
not
every. I don't actually, because of my family's in the prison, I don't actually put a paywall in it. You can subscribe if you got $6
right.
a month, please do. But
Yeah,
I don't put a paywall because they can't pay that. And so I have a weekly show out of Baltimore on the Real News, and then I have a weekly column, and we take the show, the video of the show, and turn it into a 30-minute podcast. So anyway, all of my material comes out on the Substack site.
you. In other words, if somebody subscribed to your Substack account, they'd get notice of the podcasts as well.
Yeah.
But they can also subscribe on YouTube, for example. I'm subscribed to your podcast, so
Right. I don't even know how to do that on YouTube, but it goes. So the podcast goes out on Apple, Spotify, all sorts of stuff. I don't handle the distribution, so there's probably even other sites it's on. I don't know. And that is really the audio of the video interview. So the podcast will come out on Wednesday, and then the video interview comes out on Friday and is put out by the Real News. And it gets very big numbers. I interviewed Cy Hirsch a week ago, and that's already over 1 million views on YouTube.
Wow. Well, Chris Hedges, thank you so much for taking the time, and more important, thank you for all that you do for the working families in this country, and for all of us.
You and I went to camp as scholarship kids.
That's right.
You were there on scholarship, and so was I.
Yep. It's good to see you, my friend.
Okay, Wayne. Thanks.
Take care.
Yep.
This song is dedicated to the people of the world and all its inhabitants. We've got to learn to live together with some understanding and care for each other. Let's go the extra mile and do it with a smile. Said if it's true, tell me why we cannot try. Tell me why, yes, if there is a reason why. If it's true, tell me why we cannot try. We've got the rights to talk.